Data protection and privacy teams are under more pressure than ever with new laws, AI oversight, data breaches, and the constant expectation to do more with fewer resources.
That's why TrustArc built a modern privacy and data protection management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. It unifies your tools, automates the work that slows you down, and surfaces what matters most right when you need it.
From guided quick actions to our intelligent assistant, Ask Arc, you get credible, contextual answers backed by expert research, not generic AI guesses.
Finally, privacy that works the way privacy pros work.
Learn how TrustArc helps teams move faster with confidence at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.
This is Serious Privacy by TrustArc. Here are your hosts, Paul Breitbart and Kay Royal.
Many episodes of Serious Privacy deal with current developments, whether we are talking to a guest or doing a Week in Privacy episode. However, this week we are both looking back and forward with a special guest. Barb Lawler is currently the president at the Information Accountability Foundation, but she has a long career in privacy as well. Among other things, Barb was the first Chief Privacy Officer at Hewlett-Packard and spent many years in the same role at Intuit. She's also the winner of the 2022 IAPP Vanguard Award for North America, recognizing all of her great work. At the IAF, Barb is involved in the Foundation's contributions to the global legislative privacy debate, as well as projects dealing with the future of responsible data use and data ethics. Oh, and yeah, finally, Kay has taken some vacation. She should be floating somewhere in the Caribbean right now. So, as a friend of the podcast, Ralph O'Brien has graciously agreed to once again be a vacation cover for the next episodes. My name is Paul Breitbart.
And I am not Kay Royal. My name is Ralph O'Brien, and welcome to Serious Privacy.
So Ralph and Barb, thank you for being on the show today, to see both of you and to hear both of you.
Happy to be here.
Ralph, good to have you back. To have you back as a co-host. I'm going to switch to you immediately because the co-host does the unexpected question.
The pleasure is all mine. Now, you see, Kay has the added advantage of having a pack ready, a pack of cards of unexpected questions. So how did I do it? Well, I did what everyone does when I looked on the internet, and I found some interesting existential questions. So we're not going to go too highbrow today, but actually the unexpected question I have here, Barb, and it's for you. What was the last great revelation you had? How was that? What was the last great revelation you had?
There are so many. I think the longer you've been working and been alive, the more you realize you don't know. So honestly, the most recent revelation that I had is probably a little bit nerdy because it's in the privacy space and it's specifically related to my home state of California and the current California Consumer Privacy Act and the CPRA that's coming into effect in January. And I think one of the things that companies struggle with, and even I've found as I've re-explained an idea fairly specific to CCPA, which is this idea that you can't sell data or you shouldn't be selling data, that I as an individual, as a citizen, can request that my personal information not be sold. And it's a specific link that you click on a website, and then there should be everything plugged in on the back end. A few weeks ago, I was speaking on a panel at Hastings School of Law in San Francisco. And at the time, we were trying to talk about the differences between do not sell my personal information and do not share. And I reflected back on my long career in privacy where companies wanted to say, we don't sell personal information. We're the good guys. We don't do that. And that was certainly my experience in my other privacy roles. And what became clear and which just was kind of an aha is we always used to say, we never sell personal information. We might share it, but as third parties as service providers or third parties as business partners. And then you have a role in that in terms of choice or consent. And what's different in California is that you think of sharing as the big picture and selling as the small picture and the unique special thing basically that you're not going to do. And in California, you almost have to think about it as the opposite, which is because of the very broad definition of personal information in California. And then this idea about selling information and that it's for any value, any consideration for any purpose. What that really means is that the selling is the big picture And then sharing is a very specific and contextual situation. And it's the small picture. So for privacy people, it's thinking about it kind of in the opposite way than what you did before. And that was my aha. And so I like to share it to others because I think it's a little bit of a head scratcher, because as a part of what I do now, I also have a few spinnings that I do privacy consulting work for. And one's a very small company in the talent matching space. And, they are scratching their heads. They're a little bit puzzled on, why do I need to put this do not sell my personal information link? But because it includes the scope around sharing the kind of information that's gathered from your activity on websites that then can feed into advertising, and advertising online almost exclusively involves third-party partners at some level somewhere. In certain senses, that's a very specific service provider role. But long story short, once I could explain that what's the big issue and then what's the small piece, then people actually get it, which is,
I love that.
You want to say that. So,
and what's really interesting is, without Kay here, Paul and I are both from the EU. So we have a very fundamentally different starting point when it comes to data as a human rights model.
Exactly.
And one of the things, one of the things I find really interesting over here is actually one of the things the GDPR and our privacy legislation avoids is not assigning intellectual property, not assigning ownership of data, so that it doesn't get bought and sold. Because as soon as you start buying and selling data, the rich can afford not to, and the poor sell it, and you lose that sort of free fundamental human rights approach. But back to the revelation, back to the unexpected question. I'm going to jump in with mine, and mine is very easy. I had to cheat. I had time to prepare. Mine was chips and curry sauce. How's that?
Okay. So that sounds good.
Whoa.
But now you are putting me on the spot a bit, Ralph, because now I have to choose between two favorite topics. Privacy on the one hand and food on the other. So I guess I'll go for the easy one, which is food. And then I guess my revelation is how much I actually really enjoy Middle Eastern food. Having spent some time in Jordan a couple of weeks ago for the Red Cross, that was absolutely amazing. The other revelation is that it is actually true. You can float in the Dead Sea. I've seen the pictures, I've read the stories, but you don't believe it until you actually do it.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul.
You guys are making me hungry now with all these food revelations.
I've always said that Kay and Paul should do a good sideline as a cooking podcast as well.
Maybe sometime when we have no longer 24/7 privacy jobs.
Yeah.
Keep us occupied.
Yes.
So let's dive into the content. Barb, first of all, how did you end up in privacy, and how did you become the first CPO for HP? I mean, it's quite a big role, especially if you are the very first.
And it was a very early role. So I think it's important to let folks know, because I think they're often assumptions. So I am not an attorney. I'm not a lawyer. I do often sound like one, and I think that's just the benefits or the challenge of being in this field, is that we can't help ourselves, and we often need to. So as I said, I'm a native Californian, born and raised in the Bay Area, still live here. And when I finished college, so my educational background was business and a little bit of legal studies. I often thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and so there's a little bit of irony in where I am now in my career. But Hewlett-Packard was really the aspirational company to join, and both for the career opportunities and the way that they treated people, and the HP way and those kinds of things. So I did a bunch of different things, and I start there because often the steps that you take, you don't realize where they're going to take you until you get there. And so I did everything. I worked in support. I actually worked in a call center for 8 years, which I think surprises people. It was pre-sales and technology oriented, and everything about HP was technology oriented. From there, so I talked to customers. I learned every single HP product in kind of the consumer PC commercial space and how they worked.
That's great. I mean, you learn a lot in call centers.
Yes.
And your sensitivity for certain topics also starts to grow already. I during my studies, I spent some years in customer service inbound for Vodafone, just answering questions about people's phone bills. And I realized now that at the time I wondered, why could I see all that data about basically everybody?
Yeah. And the call center was an organizational sort of flashpoint in that it was the first time all the different, really fundamentally different product lines at HP came together to help really the sales side, which was instead of calling a sales office, you called this one specific dedicated phone number. And my specialty was mini computer systems and HP systems because I had been a systems administrator for HP 3000. So I'm really dating myself there. But back in those days, you did manual data entry, product information. And so I had a person who worked for me who was doing data entry for me, who, as it turned out, was a non-functioning alcoholic. And the company sent her off to rehab, and I had to go in and fix all of her mistakes. And so before we called it data management and database management, I went straight into the database and did queries and actually corrected all of the data mistakes.
I remember writing SQL queries for Microsoft Access databases.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was.
I've got this problem with my HP Palm Pilot. Could you help me?
That is dating yourself. that was almost the era. I was telling my son last night about when I joined the call center, all of us in this particular team had to assemble our own desktop computers before we could use them, which is, even he was, wow, he had somehow not heard that story before from me. But at any rate, I set all of that as context, which is when you have kind of the data piece and then a call center, which gives you the product and the customer facing piece. And then I was a technical program manager for rolling out content management solutions for the reseller channel in North America. And then we reorganized, and in HP, you could reorganize yourself out of your job and go look for something else without losing your job back in the day. And I had people who I worked for at the call center who had created the first centralized customer database, and they had moved to the corporate function. And they said, we have this privacy job and we'd like you to interview for it. You wouldn't have a team to manage as you had in the past, but we think you'd be really good given all of these other things that you've done. And so I went up and interviewed. And it was one of those things sometimes. So that was one of the first revelatory moments, Ralph, to your earlier question, which was, I get this. I get this job. I know what needs to be done. Someone had started it, didn't know what to do. And so they were moving that person to a different role. But, It's a Small World, I think, Paul, you certainly know Scott Taylor, who's currently Chief Privacy Officer at Merck. Scott took over for me when I left HP as the Chief Privacy Officer there. He was on the interview team for me for that very first privacy job that I took.
Wow. And looking at your CV, this is 1999, right? So,
yeah,
I mean,
that was a long
for
time
us
ago.
in Europe, we had data protection laws. We were going on strong. But if I'm guessing in California in 1999, legally, there wasn't a lot, right?
There was not a lot. There certainly weren't privacy lawyers. The lawyers I worked with at the time were sort of early stage commerce lawyers, or they were actually came out of human resources with more of that fundamental rights, employee rights kind of perspective. So it was very interesting at the time. When I left the job to take the privacy job that I had, the person I worked for at the time said, isn't that the thing at the bottom of the website? What are you going to do with the rest of your day?
Well, the good thing is it's still the thing at the bottom of the website.
And now there are more things at the bottom of the website, and there's not enough days or hours in the year. But
I remember someone saying to me, so you're the person who writes the small print at the bottom of forms.
Yes, there was that. So HP had so what HP wanted to do is HP wanted to establish a world-class privacy program, and that was the mission. And so part of it was figuring out what needed to be done now and what needed to be done over time. And so Trustee was the predecessor to TrustArc, what was certainly there. There were apparently some policy and political issues internally, which is why HP didn't go with Trustee at that time and instead went with Better BBB Online. But we did privacy seals. I oversaw the rollout of updated privacy policies and practices based on what BBB Online said, which was also aligned with the very first, drumroll please, Safe Harbor Agreement.
Yes.
Predecessor to the thingy.
Yes. Oh, goodness. So HP was among the first large companies to join Safe Harbor, and that got us a lot of attention, a lot of, I think, positive reputational recognition. There wasn't as much the counterfeit. I spent a fair amount of time in Europe, particularly in France and Germany in that period, because HP had very strong relationships there and wanted to build out relationships with particularly more on the regulator side, met with the CNIA, with a couple of the different German data protection authorities, partly because HP's business at the time was already extremely global, extremely international. And so even in the early days of data transfer issues, we were dealing with things like your printer usage data, which was captured in Germany and then transferred to the manufacturing sites in Barcelona. And then also we're going to where a part of the management hub was in Singapore. And so you had issues around having the right transfer agreements in place. You had these sort of multi-step approaches. So we did a bunch of that. I had the opportunity to testify for the U.S. Congress, both the House and Senate, on proposed privacy legislation. That was in 2003. So I've jumped ahead a little bit in the timeline. And I can remember thinking at the time, privacy legislation in the U.S. at a federal level is just around the corner. Still standing on that corner. Here we are, all of these many years later, almost 20 years later. God.
Do you feel we're any closer, Barb? Do you feel you're any closer in the US to the US?
I would like to think so. It's incredibly fraught politically, and yes, I can see it. I can see it around the corner. I think the efforts around ADPPA were solid. Uniquely American, and got past kind of the issues that people have been stuck on around notice and consent regimes. I think it's interesting to focus up front as data minimization as framing. I think in the U.S. context, taking what are honestly international ideas, OECD ideas, certainly some European influences, and trying to Americanize that, if you will, for something that makes sense for the country. That more thoughtful work has done, frankly, than has been in a very long time, probably a decade. And what you run into, and it's interesting, they're not just speed humps, but true roadblocks from a policy perspective, which should take precedence. And the U.S. is a longstanding debate, states versus federals, and what should states do, and what should the federal level do, and the states, and that's what's really brought it to a screeching halt, is that California has amongst the largest representation in the Congress on the House side. The Californians really need to support what happens at the federal level. And I fully appreciate and support the idea that we don't want to take away from the states. But at the same time, it's probably not a popular opinion in this with my California colleagues or my colleagues who are supporting California is I think we need to find a way so that California is that whatever happens at the federal level is the baseline, not the ceiling. And that, but I'm not fond of the idea of California holding up federal legislation, quite honestly.
No, it is interesting. For our international viewers, it's worth mentioning that the US has this concept of federal law and state law, and this concept of preemption, which is the idea that the federal law can sometimes overwrite or set rules for state law, and sometimes vice versa. Sometimes the state law can preempt federal law. And I think this is the big argument going on at the moment, isn't it? Where you've got this idea of an American federal law, but at the same time, when you've already got pre-existing laws in California, Ohio, they're unwilling to, let's just say, drop their standards, perhaps in order of a weaker federal law that would affect everybody. Is that a good summary?
I think that's a fair summary. And I don't know that the federal approach is as weak as some would like to characterize it at. But again, that's sort of the politics and the negotiating back and forth. So we will see it come back with the new Congress in the winter and the spring. And I think that will really be governed ultimately on what the makeup of the Congress looks like after the November 8th elections here.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I mean, I'm from the UK, and so we're in a very interesting similar situation where, post-Brexit, post-EU world here in the UK, there are questions being raised by the government on whether we want the same GDPR-like laws as we have in the EU, right. Or whether we can still be essentially equivalent, but removing some of the red tape, as the government would put it. So can we change our laws but still keep our adequacy agreements? And I think we're seeing the same thing in the US with things like the executive order, and how much does the US have to change its current position to be deemed adequate, for want of a better word, by the EU? And I don't know, Barb, if you've got any strong opinions on that in terms of we've got this new executive order. The idea is that the US want to have version 3 of Safe Harbor, Privacy Shield, the thingy. I don't know if you've got any particular strong views on, do you think, EU's got to say yes? Do you think the executive order is enough? Do you, what do you feel there?
Good question. I've been thinking a lot about that. I think we've all been waiting anxiously with great anticipation for the executive order and what it would constitute. And, I will, having been through the initial Safe Harbor work and then Privacy Shield 1 and Privacy Shield 2 in my various roles over many years. First of all, I have to say the frustration on the part of American companies, and I would say multinationals based in the US or not based in the US, who have had to deal with this and focus on what are frankly procedural and administrative data transfer risk assessments and rewriting, resubmitting contracts. It becomes heavily administrative and tactical, and it takes you away from, to me, the actual kind of fundamental work that as a privacy officer or data protection officer of the work that you're doing to actually build privacy out in all of its ways, because you have to spend all of this, frankly, inordinate amount of time on procedural administrative issues. They are important, but what you're often working with are sales teams and contracting teams and procurement teams to explain and re-explain what the issues are and explain that you can't redline some of these things and you can other things. And you get stuck in this kind of never-ending cycle. So,
and I agree. Actually, funny enough, I actually share your frustrations. Anyone who knows me will know that I'm, not a great fan of a contract or a agreement or a standard contract clause. If the lawyers redline it, everybody signs it off, but nothing changes. There's actually no practical protection for the individual at the end of the day, right? So
and it's really all individuals, not just individuals in the EU. I would say, and so yes, those contractual mechanisms are really important. And when you don't have any alternatives, you end up focusing on that. So then, when we look to the executive order itself, and what that means is, yes, we'd like a new Privacy Shield or whatever you want to call it. And, it's not clear yet exactly how it's going to work for companies. And because the issues really are, again, looking at that, there's the sort of administrative and practice piece and what will we need to change in our organizations to meet the requirement based on an agreement associated with the executive order. Excuse me. We're still waiting for that. And that is going to be much more, I would expect, than just the contractual piece. But then you've got to describe it in the contractual piece. So will there be additional attestations or risk assessments required as a part of, for example? I think that's probably pretty likely. But what I was also going to say in addition to that is from the ultimate question around can and should data be transferred between the European Union and the US? And I know that it's called a data sharing agreement, but really the issues have been around data going to the US. Or I will say, in its first iterations, it was going to the US and it was going, let's use Hewlett-Packard example. It was going from Hewlett-Packard in Barcelona to Hewlett-Packard in Palo Alto headquarters. And then as things evolved over time and you had cloud-based services, it could be Hewlett-Packard in a cloud system that is in Palo Alto that's proprietary, or it could be through one of the third-party service providers. Again, that's just hypothetical. And now today,
and then it could be anywhere in the world.
Really anywhere in the world. And most companies actually specify where they want it to be. And I think there's an assumption that it's just everywhere and it's at all these different clouds. Not really. It's usually in a pretty specific set of locations that is directed by the company. But I think the other thing along with that is the fundamental issues are around how you look at government surveillance and when vault data requests come into these organizations.
Yeah.
And not all data requests and not all data processing is the same or equal. And an example that we've used, in fact, in our IAF work is around human resources related data, that if the manager and the overseeing manager for comp and promotion and evaluations is in the US, if we know companies that have had issues just with data transfers between Europe and the US for human resources management. We think the balancing of those risks are different than perhaps some other contexts that are more consumer facing. I can't let this one go without saying that this really started obviously to become an issue out of the Snowden revelations and the actions and concerns by Max Schrems focused on Facebook, but we know that focused on kind of the big tech as people talk about it. And I've heard even in the last couple of weeks, the executive order spoken about as if this is to fix or somehow correct what Facebook and Google and Amazon and some others are doing. Kind of, maybe, but that's sort of where it started.
Not really.
But not really. Yeah. This affects every company that has international data transfers between Europe and the US, regardless of their business. And I think it is distracting and it takes people away from kind of the core issues around how multinational organizations actually work. And actually do business. And that it's the same for pharmas. It's the same for retail. It's the same for consumer goods. It's the same for, pick an industry practically. And it affects all of them. So this is not just a big tech issue by any stretch.
And that's what I found fascinating, actually. I liked that the executive order, there was sort of a reciprocal nature there, where it kind of said, actually, the US will recognize countries that they think is going to be okay to transfer data. I mean, the UK, we were very fast out of the gates to say, oh, we're going to be one of them,
Yes.
Think of me, think of me.
But we're relevant, me. So, I like the actual
and the UK is relevant.
Well, you can have a very long political discussion about that, Barb.
Of course. And
economically, they are still relevant.
I'm really glad you mentioned the IAF again, because we covered the early part of your career. But, first of all, congratulations, by the way, on the IAPP Vanguard Award this year. I mean, that's got to mean something to you. So, I mean, perhaps now, because we talked about the early part of your career, we've talked about current issues. I guess the next thing we could really talk about is, what the Information Accountability Foundation does. Because, I'll be honest, I'm not exactly clear what the Internet Accountability Foundation does. So if you could educate me and our viewers, that would be wonderful. And what it is that exactly led up to your IAPP Vanguard Award.
Okay. Two really different yet somehow intertwined questions. So let me handle the Information Accountability Foundation piece first, the IAF for short. The IAF was founded in 2013 by Marty Abrams. He currently acts as the Chief Policy Innovation Officer. Prior to that, Marty was the founder of the Center for Information Policy Leadership, which still exists today it was Hutton & Williams, and they have a slightly different name now. But
Kurt,
yes,
I believe.
Yes. I always remember the first part, and all mergers in law firms happen too. But the IAF actually started as a non-profit breakout rather than a for-profit think tank. And most think tanks should be non-profit anyway, but a not-for-profit think tank focused on global policy issues, and particularly around this concept of accountability. And Marty's work around accountability, both at CIPL and then at the IAF, you find in really policy and legislative proposals around the world. We believe it's important that data be able to serve people, but in a responsible and ethical way. And so we focus on multi-stakeholder discussions that develop frameworks, policy guidance, and policy input into, again, legislative and policy issues around the world around information. So not just personal data, but around information policy issues. And some of the things we're working on right now is, what's the current state of corporate research or knowledge creation? How do you take a broader view of looking at all the fundamental rights or fundamental interests that individuals have, data privacy and data protection as a construct for that? Because we do think it's critical that organizations are able to think and act with data, and that if it's done in an accountable and responsible way. So accountable means being responsible and answerable, and that you're prepared to demonstrate your accountability. That's kind of the nut of accountability. We try and be forward-looking, 3, 5, 10 years out, what's happening now, what's happening going forward, particularly as we see more and more uses of data, controversial uses of data, uses of data. And as the digital age continues to advance, and I will say advance to what some people are calling Web.3, some people are calling augmented reality or virtual reality. We're continuing to see very rapid technology changes. And so we're looking at how do we evolve our thinking and our policy recommendations or policy guidance, looking ahead, not looking backwards, but not looking ahead.
And also not just looking at what the issue of today, but really, well, by the end of the decade, and what do we need to prepare for, which I think has always meant a little bit, at least in Marty's time, that he was always 3, 4, 5 steps ahead of the crowd, and everybody needed time to let his message sink in and then catch up with the things that he discussed and proposed, which doesn't make it always easy for everybody to understand what it is about. Whereas a few years down that line, you actually realize, oh, he was right. And it, especially when it comes to accountability. I mean, I recall my initial conversations with Marty, but also with Terry McQuaid from Nimity, who was very much inspired by Marty's accountability approach about this whole accountability thing. And while I was still with the Dutch DPA, I thought, yeah, right, companies going to demonstrate that they comply with the law. We need enforcement. We need verification. Of course, it's nice to trust companies, but control is better. Yeah. That was very much my stance at the time. And I've completely come around. And I think that a lot of companies have come around to that accountability approach. Yeah. So I'm curious what we'll see from the IAF for the end of the decade, where everybody now starts putting their heels in the sand and say, oh, no, this is not going to work. And then slowly get used to it and starts to accept it.
One of the things that I found real quickly is accountability can work and resonate in a way for smaller and medium companies. We always think about the big companies and the big tech companies, but smaller companies actually understand the basic concepts, which is understand what you do, be able to describe what you do, verify what you do, be able to explain to others what you do, and ultimately to prove when you have to in a regulatory oversight context. Because I just think it's so important that, Paul, you mentioned that the trust issues and, enforcement is important. Enforcement is always a part of the equation, but enforcement is after the fact and sometimes a long time after the fact. And we could even point to data transfer issues and what prompted the executive order as a great example of that. And I think there also needs to be incentives or something that, again, smaller companies that don't have a CPO, they may have someone involved in privacy who may be a privacy attorney or a privacy program manager, something like that, something that they can get their head around, that they can explain, because then they often are in this, very complicated sort of diplomacy mission across an organization, trying to explain what is it we're doing and why are we doing it and why is it important. And it can't just be, we might get in trouble and then we don't have a way to prove it, or we need to have a way to prove it. It gets at what I find over and over again is most companies actually want to do the right thing. They just don't know how. And the how is where the magic happens. That was frankly why I felt like I was so successful, both at HP and then at Intuit and beyond, which is you can say what you're going to do, but you have to figure out how. And it's different from every department and organization. You have to be that translator. And this is how we're going to do it. It's the challenges we see with California. It's just, how am I going to do this do not sell thing? How am I going to do this global privacy control signal? Because if it works on the front end, it can't just be a policy. It can't just be training. And these are fundamentals we all know. But being able to turn that into a how, whether you are a big multinational or a small, regional company is important. And I think we want companies to be compliant, and companies want to be compliant. And I think sometimes certain policymakers and regulators, they want it. They want compliance to be rigorous and detailed and complex. And I won't say hide the ball, but it's like beauty. We'll know it when we see it, and you can do a lot of work and not know that you've done it right. I guess what I would say, or at least done it well. I'm not even sure there's a right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm even encouraging organizations to drop that approach, that right and wrong, compliant, non-compliant approach, because the word compliance tend to lead me to this sort of binary yes/no decision-making.
Yes,
And
exactly.
actually with data and with, especially, you look at a European principle-based approach, it's all risk management, right? It's all risk management. It's all shades of gray. It's decision-making. It's, with that accountability pieces, arguing your sides of a legitimate interest equation, arguing your side of your risk assessment approach, and so for me, the word compliance tends to lead organizations down this road where they do a one-off assessment and then checklist and wash their hands and off they go, forgetting about it, as opposed to,
oh no, but we've implemented GDPR 5 years ago, so we don't have to care about that anymore because it's
Yeah. It's never done. One of the things that comes out of GDPR that, although we don't see it in the U.S. states really to speak of so far, I think there's one exception. Surprising, I haven't read all of the different U.S. states. I've focused on California and Colorado and Virginia because those are coming first. But more specifically,
not a surprise.
You haven't asked the question yet, but when we think about looking forward and we think about the continued rapid evolution of technology, I think a couple things are fundamental. Is all companies are data companies, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah.
And should operate that way. What's the fundamental foundational thing that all companies should be doing? And obviously, if you're a very large company, it's more complicated than a smaller company, but is this whole idea around data inventory and data mapping and knowing exactly what your core business processes are, why you do the process. Because if you start with the business piece, that resonates more, that looks more for the internal folks, which is, we're doing this to meet this strategic business objective. And then you look at what's the data that's collected along the way and why and where does it go, and actually have that inventory. Because then how do you know your privacy policies are accurate? How do you know your security policies are implemented if you don't have that foundational data map, data inventory, the reasons, the rationale for processing, whatever that is in whatever jurisdiction? And to me, that then is, and I've had people say, well, that's not a privacy thing. That's a security thing, or that's a data operations thing, or it's a something else
It's a basic
thing.
business
And
thing.
I think it's a basic business thing that serves multiple business functions. And that's what I've found, is that you do that and it gets you to privacy, but it gets you at ideas that we're exploring at the AF around what does it mean to have business resiliency and data sustainability, so that data is used responsibly and ethically, and you don't. But first you have to know what you have, and so I think that also points you to, as a company, to more structured and engineering or design approaches to privacy. So you can call it privacy by design, but I would say it's even privacy engineering, which having a more structured approach to those things. And so I think privacy leaders, whether they're a CPO or a DPO or a privacy operations manager or an analyst, understanding that fundamental data mapping piece and then being able to translate that and really build your expertise to talk with your engineering teams, your product teams, your other teams. Because again, I'm going to say every company is a data company, whether they realize it or not. And so the more you can speak the language of data and technology versus privacy, I think, that to me, that is one of the fundamental directions of the privacy function as a whole, is being able to do that.
I mean, talking of revelations, I remember Peter Hustinink's
yes,
absolutely floored me one day, because again, like Paul was saying, I was standing up and I was doing why aren't we enforcing? Why aren't we taking companies down that have broken the law? Why are regulators standing up and talking about data ethics? Ethics isn't their job. They should just enforce the law that is there. And, Peter Hustinink's kind of floored me by saying, look, if companies proactively put in good data ethics and manage information properly, we wouldn't need to enforce.
Because don't you want companies to be compliant without the threat of the enforcement? Enforcement you always need for outliers and unique situations, but enforcement as the only mechanism just is, when enforcement is the only mechanism, it's the hammer and everything looks like a nail, to use that very old truism.
Yeah, and I think that is true. At the same time, companies probably want to be compliant, but it has become so very difficult because there are so many different data protection obligations,
Yes.
especially if you are a multinational company. I mean, we have GDPR, but we do have 30 iterations of GDPR.
Yes.
And then the UK GDPR on top of that. And then we have similar laws in other European countries. Then we have similar laws
in Latin America
around the world
and
that are inspired by GDPR,
Yes.
and some that are completely different because they are still based on the old directive or on another
or another way of thinking.
Other set of
It is similar.
Yeah, and all the privacy principles are the same. They're similar.
That's why I like principle-based.
But they're not the same.
Yeah,
but
similar but different. That's what I tell people about the UK GDPR when I'm training people here in the UK. I say, you know, if you only know the EU GDPR, you probably know enough to be dangerous, right? It's the, it's similar but different. You know, you need to. So yeah, but the principle-based is good. You know, the OECD principles. Let's face it, 1980, right? They have, you know, 42 years later, they haven't changed. What's anyone's excuse? That's the way I say.
Yes. And I would say they've evolved somewhat. And I know the OECD continues to do that work. And in fact, the IAF is involved in a couple of discussion groups through Marty in particular. But fundamental principles are fundamental principles and don't change. But how, again, what they mean in new contexts and how you apply them will change.
Well, Barb, I hate to do this, but we have been promising our listeners, and Kay has been promising our listeners, that we're going to try and keep these podcasts short. I'm sure you, Paul, and I, we could talk into the wee hours of the morning over a dram of whiskey and never run out of topics to talk about. But I'm afraid, you know, it's probably time that we call time on our discussion for today.
All right. Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking with you both.
Indeed. And Barb, thank you.
Well, thank you, Barb. And indeed, thanks to our listeners for joining yet another episode of Serious Privacy. If you like to join the conversation, follow us on LinkedIn. You'll find us at Serious Privacy, or join us on Twitter at Podcast Privacy. You'll find me on Twitter as at EuropoleB, Kay as Heart of Privacy, and Ralph at
IGR O'Brien.
And you can find me at Barb GS10.
I'm following now.
Yes.
Very good. So we'll put all the links in the show notes. Thank you very much. And until our next episode. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
That was Serious Privacy.
If you're a data protection or privacy professional, you already know the pressure. Non-stop regulatory change, AI oversight, internal demands, and the expectation to somehow stay ahead of it all. And the old patchwork of tools just isn't cutting it anymore.
No. That's why TrustArc created a modern privacy management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. The TrustArc platform brings your workflows, evidence, research, tasks, and applications all together in one unified and intelligent workspace, so you don't waste time digging, clicking, or context switching.
With Ask Arc, your privacy assistant, you can ask plain language questions about laws, jurisdictions, or even your own program data, and get credible, cited answers based on NIMBY research and more than 1,000 global laws. It's explainable, transparent, and purpose-built for data protection and privacy.
So if you need to add a vendor, create a cookie banner, or start an assessment, quick actions take formally complex tasks, turn them into bite-sized guided workflows to save you time.
It's a platform that thinks like you, works like you, and helps you move faster with confidence, whether you're a seasoned DPO or you're just getting started.
See how modern privacy gets done. Explore Arc at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.